Okay, thank you very much. I'm very proud of all of you for staying to the bitter end. We've had a really good collection of talks and panel discussions, which have been quite useful. I think the way we're going to run this last bit of the session is we'll have two speakers who will be wrapping up their respective programs. I'd like to introduce first Sue McCluskey, who spoke earlier today, and I believe she'll come up and provide some input on what she thinks is most important. When she's done, then we will go back to Armadale, and then we'll have Paul Wood give his summation. Okay, Sue.
Well, thank you, everyone. Wow, what a wonderful day. I learned so much and we heard so much, about biopeptides, physical and digital assets, the opportunity for AI to meet the protein needs of the growing population, and then those fantastic innovations from just those passionate entrepreneurs, and of course the humble brag. I love that. The humble brag. I think it's something that we all need to do. I have the opportunity, of course, to travel around Australia, hear some of the great stories and brag about it in global markets. But I think it's something we all need to do. So I'm going to have a go at trying to sum up what I've heard today and a couple of the action items, but then Paul is going to be able to clean up after me and be able to cover everything that I've missed. I think one of the things that came through, though, and we heard this from so many different people, was that there is no one size fits all. There's no one same farmer, there's no one same farm, no same environment or production system. And what this means is we're going to have a whole suite of solutions, and there is no single silver bullet. So I think that really couches how I'm going to go through the different areas. So the first one that came to mind really in listening to everyone speak today was around collaboration, the critical role that data brings there, the benefits of collaboration and borderless innovation. So I think one of the things that we really need to think about is how we really increase our collaboration and partnerships, both domestically and particularly internationally. So that's a clear call to action, I think. The second area, of course, was around communications. And once again, we've heard many examples of how we need to communicate differently with whether it's the farmer, with the consumer, or whether it's the customer. So I think we need to think about the language we use from the user perspective. And we also heard about the use of intermediaries to be able to better integrate AgTech on the farm. So for me, I just read that as being more than extension. It really is how do we actually use intermediaries to be able to help us take up tech. And the other thing I heard, which was probably coming from the work that I do, is we heard a lot about animal health, plant health and soil health. But I think particularly for the consumer, it's connecting it with human health and the importance that we put into soil health and animal and plant health that actually completely underpins human health. Then there was the area of labour, and we heard, which was interesting, that AgTech is not necessarily replacing humans, but it's more about humans working side by side with tech, so perhaps apart from in the packing sheds. It really is how we are actually getting humans to continue to work together. And so I think there's an action here to explore opportunities around autonomy and how humans can work with machines. There's also opportunities around skills, and look, the skills shortage is a challenge. And many, many years ago, when I first came into the ag sector, and I used to say, how do we get more farmers into agriculture? How do we make agriculture sexy? Well, I think we found the sexy bit because it is about tech. And so it really is how do we actually bring young people into that? And I think the other thing we heard around labour was being able to explore more ways that we can connect students with businesses. That gives them the pathway to jobs, but we also heard how the lived experience really is the massive driver of innovation. The regulatory environment, I think we heard quite a bit about, and how do regulators really keep up with just the amazing pace that technology is changing? I always say to government that the private sector is way ahead of the public sector, and it's really the role of government to be able to set the enabling environment and then get out of the way. But to be able to set that enabling environment in such a fast-moving arena, they really need to work with industry. So for me, it's about making sure we have a good process of co-design, so we can actually get industry and government in the room and say, how are we going to start to think about what are the challenges here? What are the moving pieces, and how do we actually work together? In the end, we want the same outcome. So how do we actually sandpit, pilot, and actually do that proper, true co-design process? So I did take it from Scott that we can look to do a pilot with APVMA around something that we can come up with. Sustainability was really interesting for me because, of course, it's front of mind for me. My whole life is around sustainability. And listening to the panel this morning around investment, it was interesting to hear that it wasn't a core driver. And it was more about profitability and resilience. But when I thought about it, I mean, it's the same thing when I talk to farmers. They don't talk about sustainability because it's just what they do as custodians of the land. So I thought that was really interesting because it really is looking at through a risk lens. Farmers understand risk. Governments actually understand risk. So if we actually think about it through a risk lens, it really gets around the different connotations around language. And interestingly, in Argentina last week, I was asked a question at Congress about how do I deal with the climate deniers? And I say, I don't actually talk to farmers about climate change. I talk to them about risk. And they know about dealing with the differences in climate every day. So I think risk is a good lens to look through it. And then I'm just going to end on capital because, of course, money makes the world go round. We've heard a lot about money. And just noting that, it was said a number of times that venture capital isn't the only way to fund. I think we really do need to start to have some good, robust conversations about who funds research, who funds startups, who funds investment, and the difference between public and private funding, but also the difference between public and private benefits. I'm also the founder of a startup, so I know the challenges that you have when you try to get that initial funding and you go through family and friends, you try to get angel investment, but you're not going to get anything more because other companies and investors are not going to take the risk. That's where I see a true role for government. That's where government and the universities actually can have that real role at that blue sky, taking the risk, backing something to see if it has a chance. And when I hear that we have a whole lot of foreign governments come knocking on the doors of some of our great entrepreneurs and we could lose some of the smarts overseas, I think that's really disappointing. So I think that's something that we can take forward. So David, I'll probably leave it there, and Paul will cover everything else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a really excellent and succinct review of part of what we've heard. So now we're going to do a truly hybrid session. We're going to transfer this over to Armidale, where Professor Paul Wood, who's a board member of ATSE, and he also has a lot of experience with commercial R&D leadership in places like CSIRO and Pfizer and at a CRC in vaccine technology. So what I'd like to do is have Paul give his summation, and then when he's done, I'd like to take a few minutes for the Sydney audience to tell you about the tour that we have tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. So I'm always conscious, I've been told that you never want to be the speaker between an Australian audience and a drink. So I can promise you this won't be long. But there are some really important things and a couple of messages I'd like people to take away. And, thanks for the audience for sticking with us. I know it's a long day. So I thought, reflecting on today, how appropriate was it that we had our welcome to country today? And we're talking about AgTech, we're talking about this land. So we start with actually a welcome to country from the people who've actually been managing this land forever. The first technologists. So, it's popular these days to question, is it just tokenism? but it's not in this profession. I mean, we're all about protecting the land. So to hear from them today, for them to welcome us and wish us well, I thought was a really appropriate way to start. We had the fabulous Sue McCluskey kick off. I'm not going to go through all of Sue's things, but there's a couple of really important points there. You know, the NFF set this target. You know, agriculture should be a $100 billion industry by 23. We're at 90 billion. We need to reset the target. We're going to overshoot, you know. So what a great situation we're in. Because when they set that target, remember, there was a lot of criticism. You know, we can't do that. Now we're going to overshoot it. So she reminded us about that. 70% of what we produce in the agriculture is exported. We're a major exporting country. And again, it came out in the questions, about regulations. As an export country, we've got to always be mindful that our overseas customers will set those expectations. So it's not just us setting them, and we're reminded of that today. We feed 65 million people. So again, I can remember laughing during COVID and the shelves were bare and people said, we're running out of food. We're never going to run out of food in this country because of our farmers. We're really good at producing quality food. We had a logistics supply problem at that stage, but we didn't have a food problem. We didn't have a problem with producing food. Sue also said to us, make sure you tell your stories through the lens of users. And then I sat there in Lou's session and thought, this group's learnt that lesson because they told the story. They told their stories, but they told their stories focused on their users. What was the problem? And this is, I think, Lou deliberately pushed. What's the problem you're solving? Who are your users? So we heard that beautiful story. They obviously knew Sue's message there. We heard from Scott, and again, he reminded us that issue about we are a trading nation, so we have to make sure we abide by those regulations that's set by overseas customers, even when they're frustrating. He also acknowledged that APMA needs to improve. I mean, many of us who work with us, it's a tough nut. And so I'm really personally thankful to Scott and to Steve Jeffries, who's on the board, for taking up that challenge. It's a tough challenge, but it's a really necessary one because we are known as a clean green. We trade very heavily on the quality that is inbuilt into our agricultural systems. So organisations like APMA need to be very strong to make sure we maintain that. We got onto automation. Sala gave a great rundown on those robots. Who couldn't be impressed when you actually see them in paddocks? And he just focused on the field crops. Not the visual ones that are picking oranges, not the ones that can look up and grade whether your fruit is ready and ripe to produce. So that whole automation bit is really important because when you go out and talk to farmers, what is our major three problems? Labour, labour and labour. It's really hard in this country. So I thought that was really good. Jay reminded us that Australian farmers have a good bullshit detector. Now, I've embellished that a little bit, but that's what he was saying. So, this is a reminder to AgTechs when you're going out there. They are suspicious because, the last three people who came and chatted to them, they probably oversold it. So we've got to be really careful. I didn't hear in that last session anyone overselling at all. Their products actually sell for themselves. But there is a lot of people who have that tendency to over pitch. And when you do that with our farmers, they're pretty good at sensing it. That's their bullshit detectors. We got into talking about finance, and we had a really great session from that panel. Sarah reminded us, as a VC, that VC is not the only model, and maybe not the best model for AgTech, because VC is not patient capital. And that was from someone who runs a VC. So she was very honest. But if you go and look at her VC company, they've got a 10-year investment horizon. So it's not your typical VC. So, we do need to look at those other companies. We all know about the 3 Fs when you start any startup: friends, family, and fools. That's how we start. And we've heard some of that. Sustainability. It was really important that it was brought back to us that has to be linked to profitability. Farmers can't continue to eat cost. You can't impose something and say you must follow this. Well, let's talk about what's happening in the methane space. Things like Bovair or Theop, it doesn't have any productivity gain. So it's just reducing methane. So it's an input cost for a farmer. There has to be some compensation. And at the moment, the processors are actually wearing that because they want the Scope 3 emission credits. We heard about that. They've maxed out their Scope 1 and Scope 2. They're going after Scope 3. They don't want to go to the farmers with a big stick. They want to go with a solution. Here is the solution. If you follow this program, we will pay for it, and they'll take the Scope 3 credit. So there's the win. We're seeing that in other areas as well. So that's sustainability. Let's not forget that profitability is really important. Labour. 2% of the Australian population is involved in farming. Sue reminded us that we do need to come to the city and tell people about that. I'd hope that through COVID people would have a better awareness of where their food came from. But unfortunately it disappeared like COVID did. And people seem to have forgotten again. So we need to continue to remind people. We also need to continue to remind our farmers to be very proud of what they do. You know, you can be very proud of feeding not only this nation, but many other nations as well. We have an image problem because, again, there's this look out there. I was on the dairy board for 6 years. Very hard to get labour. People look at it and go, it's just really hard manual work. Did anyone hear a hard manual work story today? You know, we don't tell enough about the story, about the people we need in this industry. We need the people. We need engineers. We need agronomists. You know, we need all those STEM careers. It's something that ATSE is pushing very heavy. We have a big lack. We lack 50,000 engineers already in Australia. And we lack in many other areas, and I think we heard that a few times today. Uptake. We keep talking about uptake is really hard, but the thing we don't acknowledge is that 100% of the farmers are not our market. It's about 25% at best in any one sector. In the dairy industry, when we went out and we segmented dairy farmers into 5 groups, there's that group, you know, the corporates, and they're not just corporates, family farms, the big family farms. You know, they go out and get their own tech. They bring in their own tech already. They're ready, you know. But there's 25% who are just hanging into the industry. You know, they're not thing. And then there's people in the middle. So in every sector, you can segment. So you've only got about 25% that are really your customers. And we need to identify those. It's where the RDCs, we have 15 RDCs in this country. They spend $500 million a year on R&D. $500 million. Part of that comes from the government. But they're not doing enough to help AgTechs to identify those farmers and work with those farmers. And that's from someone who's sat on a board and worked with a couple of RDCs. We need to do better in that space of connecting our AgTech community with the farmers who are the go-getters, either because they're a big farmer or because there's generational change. And then there's the new young farmer who's coming in who wants to shake things up. Regulatory, we heard about some of the challenges, and I forget who it was. I think it might have been Sarah who said, we actually shouldn't be complaining all about regulatory. We should be able to think about how do we turn it into an advantage. And we already do that. You know, our clean green image comes from a strong and sound regulatory environment. I'll give you one example of where another industry who has turned this into an advantage. If you look at our medical industry, we made it easier to do phase 1 clinical trials in Australia. We now largely lead the world in phase 1 clinical trials. There's billions and billions of dollars coming in this country to do phase 1 clinical trials. What does it also give us? It gives us access to those new drugs. So there's an example where they've taken a regulatory challenge and turned it into an advantage. We need to start thinking about that. With these challenges, how would we turn them into an advantage? Ben Hayes gave us a great thing on breeding technologies. You know, if you ever thought we were going to run out of the room to actually breed better crops or better animals, Ben showed you that it's, you know, there's a whole new, you know, AI in farming was pretty straightforward. It was artificial insemination, you know. Now he showed you that artificial intelligence and what it can do in our breeding systems. So there was enormous there. He touched on, for me, one of my heroes of early tech in this country. And that's a guy called Rod Polkinghorne, if you know him. I met Rod in the 80s, and Rod was telling me this story about people would pay a higher price for a piece of meat if I could guarantee the eating quality. And people just laughed. This is the 1980s. And Rod never gave up, and he's still not given up. And it underpins our meat industry now. We heard from Matt, you know, I think 3.5 million animals going through the MSA system, largely based on the philosophies that Rod Polkinghorne had in the 1980s. So, you know, sometimes it takes some time, but Rod's still out there. We heard that the number one trait still is yield, but it's 50%, I think, if you look at those figures. Yes, we overdid it in the dairy industry, and we lost on fertility, and it's very hard to milk a cow if you can't get her pregnant. So, you know, we've had to back off that. So there's some warning signs there about what we should need to do. Crossing boundaries. Nina told us about plants and animals. When I grew up, you know, I did animal work. So you never talked to the plant people. And then you suddenly looked at the genetics work now and said, we're using all the same background information. Patient capital. Michael talked again about those breeding herds, how important they are. Sally Ann, as usual, fabulous talking about cicada and what a great example it was. Reminded us that innovation is not linear. You know? That it doesn't just come out of our universities. Government procurement. I saw this in operation when I worked in the States. It's so important. And we just don't know it. And we've been talking to governments for so long about this. It's about time they actually listened. We're not talking about massive. I think, Sally, your figure was 2%. If you just did 2%, that would be enough to really help. So that's great if they could start. We worked about skilled staff. Yes, we're on that. Start with the problem. We heard from the last group. I think it's a great way to do. We've got too much tech looking for a problem. And there's some out there, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll find there's a particular technology that I have a problem with. Not solving a problem, unfortunately. So let me finish with a bit of a plug for ATSI first. So when we were planning this, we deliberately thought to partner with Meg and her association because we wanted to bring in fresh thinking and the startup community. So that was a really important thing for us to do that. And we heard from Meg that we need a national strategy for AgTech. And Meg, when you guys are ready, we would love to actually partner with you in helping to take that to government, helping maybe to frame that, but particularly helping to take that to government. ATSI runs a national mentoring program for young PhD students and postdocs. Industry mentors only, and we do over 400 a year. This is our 10th year, and we have over 2,500 people who've been through that program. So it's just simply about industry professionals talking to these people about what industry is like. 2 or 3 out of 10 PhD students will end up with a long-term academic career. So the other 7 have got to start thinking about what it is, and industry in its multiple fashions. Okay, industry is not one entity, but we need to talk to them about what industry looks like, all the sorts of jobs that are there. We are about skilling. A lot of what we do is about skilling up the STEM community in this country. So please come and talk to us if you think we can help in that area. You've seen the ATSI fellows, they've got that FTSE against them. We're not all one. We're not just old white guys like me. We come in lots of different flavours. And it's something we're working hard on in the diversity of our academy. So, please come and talk to us. And I'm going to finish on a personal story. And it's about tech. But in 1980, as we were trying to clean up brucellosis and TB, I see a few people in this room are probably old enough to remember those diseases. The cattle industry was worried about it, and they came to CSIRO and they said, could you have a crack at designing a new way to diagnose TB in cattle? Hadn't been a new TB test since Robert Koch in 1890. But we thought, yeah, we'll have a crack at that. So that was the cattle industry. MLA came along. I don't know if Matt's still with us. Came along and supported us. We invented a new test in 1985. CSL commercialised and it went out in the market in 1990. It probably wasn't that important in the end in helping to clear up TB in this country, but we did eradicate those two diseases. Not many countries have, but we eradicated two major diseases. Not because they were major issues for our cattle, but they were zoonotic diseases, so they're major issues for human health. And someone earlier, I think Sally, you reminded us of that connection into human health. But an interesting thing happened as that was winding down. CSL came to me and said, Paul, do you think that test could be used in humans? And I said, yeah, actually I started testing in humans because I didn't have the tools in cattle. And it works in humans. So they went ahead and it went through a few iterations. What I can tell you today is that's now the standard of care around the world. Quantiferon is the standard of care. It came out of the work that was funded by red meat industry in this country in 1985. We never thought it could do that. It's the great thing about science. When you start, you never know what it could turn into. But it now literally saves thousands of lives every year because we early diagnose those people and they're treated. So you never know what's going to happen. We don't tell enough about the story about how we are integrated into human health, not just in feeding, but in many of the technologies. So with that, I'll invite Gunilla Burrows. Gunilla has been the chair of this organising committee. When we started, it was going to be, a 4-month exercise, and a year or so later, we're here. But I hope you will join me in thanking Gunilla and her team.